Welcome to Fragmented, an AI developer podcast that helps vibe coders become software engineers, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Kaushik.
And I'm Yuri, the other host of Fragmented, where I'd love to talk about using AI to make you a better developer.
Mitchell Hashimoto is a living legend in the world of DevOps. He co-founded a company called HashiCorp. If you've ever used Vagrant, basically the most common OS virtualization tool out there, that's HashiCorp. If you talk to your colleagues over at the infra department, you'll probably hear them talk about this service called Terraform, one of the most common tools used for maintaining infrastructure deployments. Well, that's again a product of HashiCorp and what Mitchell built. If you work at a medium or large-sized company that runs anything on the cloud, there's a good chance you're using HashiCorp's tools and what Mitchell built there. And those are just some of the popular ones I've used and can remember. There's a whole bunch more. But perhaps most of our listeners on Fragmented and most of the kids getting into AI development today know him from something else entirely. Mitchell sold HashiCorp to IBM, and instead of just riding off into the sunset, he rolled up his sleeves and built what is probably the most current and coolest, I must say, terminal apps today. It's an absolute honor to open our AI guest series with the one and only Mitchell Hashimoto. Thank you for joining us today, Mitchell.
Thanks. I didn't know I was your first on this, so that's exciting. Cool.
Yeah, it's the first in the AI series.
The AI, right.
I have to open up by saying, Mitchell, Ghostty is probably my second most used app, period. After my browser. My browser is the only thing you haven't beaten just yet.
Yeah, we won't.
But in your words, why should I use Ghostty? Mac OS has terminal, I'm sure. Windows has PowerShell. Linux has some built-in terminal that work well. What is it about Ghostty that, makes you feel like people should give it a shot?
Yeah, okay. So, I think it's important to frame the fact that I started Ghostty for myself and not, to solve what I was looking for and not thinking from the angle of what's going to get the most downloads. And so from that angle for myself, what I really wanted was I wanted something that worked on Mac and Linux because I work like 50-50, 60-40 on Mac and Linux. I split time. I wanted something that felt native on both of those. It's like I wanted something that felt like a beautiful, polished Mac OS app and the Apple ecosystem on Mac. And I wanted something that felt like it was built for my desktop environment on Linux. And then I wanted it to be fast. I think, those three, I think that existing terminals are a pick two of those things. So for example, I think Kitty is an excellent terminal. Like whenever someone says they're using Kitty, I'm not sad about that at all. I'm like, cool, that's really good. But it's not native at all, right? Like if you create a tab, it's some weird like ASCII pixelated thing. And native goes far beyond that. Like Ghostty on Apple, Mac has Apple Script integration, Apple Shortcuts integration. I want to do some form of iCloud syncing. Like native, to me, the definition of native is you should be taking full advantage of whatever platform primitives you're running on. So that's sort of the thinking is Kitty is fast and it's cross-platform, but it's not native. Terminal is just one of those things. It's nothing, so on and so forth. So that was my motivating factor. And for people today that are adopting it, I love getting feedback. I get a lot of people that will say, you built a Mac app first, or you built a Linux app first. I mean, the fact that people can't tell means that we're doing the native thing really well. For the record, the Linux app was first. So
no way, I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah, we didn't have a Mac app for over a year at all. The speed, people always say, I've never felt my terminal slow. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it's because you've never tried one that's fast. And so in the sense that if you think that all cars go, 20 miles per hour, you're going to be like, I get to my place is fine. And then you like get in a car that goes 60 miles per hour and you're like, okay, that's pretty nice. I noticed that. And I've heard very consistently that people adopt Ghostty and they're pleasantly surprised how much the speed impacts their day-to-day.
No, that makes sense. Inherently as a terminal too, there are certain features that most terminals of past didn't support, like, really good font rendering, like, colored underlines or waved underlines, things that you would think a modern app in this day and age would support. Surprisingly, not as many terminals of the past have implemented. What has been interesting for me is like a lot of those tiny features, like another one, synchronized output, like, those are kind of interesting features. How much of that was also the goal, right? Which is like, hey, let's bring this world forward.
Yeah. I mean, a terminal is a platform for other applications. Like I know that a lot of people say that aspirationally, and I say that very literally. Like it is a place where other applications run. They just happen to be text-based applications versus a browser, which is more, graphical based. And so you need to be able to provide these platform features that people expect, which is a certain amount of text rendering, a certain amount of window management, a certain amount of input, keyboard, mouse, etc. And I think that I like to break it down as there are terminal emulators and there are terminals, because if you're someone who really focuses in on the fact that a terminal emulator is emulating a piece of hardware from the 80s or 90s or 70s, depending which version of hardware, but if you view it as an emulator of that hardware, then you don't believe in that innovation. You're just trying to run applications on that existing technology. It wouldn't make any sense if someone was creating a Nintendo Game Boy emulator and then added 3D graphics that didn't exist to it then. Like, people would argue that's not an emulator anymore. And so I actually say that Ghostty is a terminal emulator because we do emulate those things, but it is really more of a terminal because we're just moving forward with the definition where we're no longer emulating. We still do, but for all the future facing features, we're not emulating anything. We're innovating or really others are innovating and we're adopting their features too, is what right now is how it's working. And I think that's really important because I do think a lot of applications work really well in a text-based fashion. And I think AI is a great example of that. Right. AI does not care about how things look. It just wants data in, data out. And CLIs are really good at that. They're easy to run. They're easy to compose with each other. It's a really good platform for AI and I would say agentic AI in particular to interface with. And so we're seeing a renaissance in terminals. Like, if you told me when I started Ghostty, because I started Ghostty before ChatGPT came out, if you told me that it would lead to more terminal usage due to AI, I would have laughed at you. Like, I was doing it for fun. I didn't see terminals growing, but they're absolutely growing. And it's really amazing to see.
You were mentioning like the speed and performance and how is that important in Ghostty and whatnot. And now with AI, I think one of the big reasons people are moving to Ghostty, like especially, is because like Cloud Code, for example, it just performs better there.
Yep.
There's a lot of issues with performance in Cloud Code in general. So how do you see that? Like Ghosty's role in that sense?
Yeah, the more powerful you make a platform, the more powerful the applications above the platform become. You even see this with the browser. Like, I think everyone agrees that the browser is a hyper-optimized, super fast piece of technology for what it does. And every time you make the browser faster, you find front-end applications that push the boundaries and make it feel slow again.
Right.
And that's good. Like, how could you have ever had a product like Figma if you didn't push the boundaries of what browsers are capable of?
Right.
And I always Cloud Code to me is like the 90s version of Figma for the terminal. Like, it's pushing it and it's forcing terminals to do better and ship more features because we want to see what else is possible. And I still think the runway there is pretty long where we will see like the next thing that blows people away about what terminals are capable of. And it's just because you got to build the platform to do more for that to be possible. And that's what I want to do.
There's this whole thing with scroll back, right? And Cloud Code and how it performs and versus there's a different alternative like full screen GUIs. Do you have a preference there or what's your opinion there?
I do think that fundamentally all these agentic coding apps should have scroll back, but I think they're picking the full screen TUIs as a compromise because it's easier to create these. It's easier to create a TUI based on what they're using. It's called the alternate screen or secondary screen. It's easier to create TUIs within that framework because what ends up the problem that we're going to get a little bit deep here on the technical, but the problem with the scroll back, which is called primary screen in terminals, is that the program that's drawing to the screen can only address the visible part of the terminal. Like, you could move the cursor and draw things anywhere, but 0, 0 starts at the top left of what's the bottom part of the terminal. And so as soon as you write to the bottom and you force a scroll up and it goes into the scroll back, you can never, ever redraw what was back there ever again. And so what Claude Code does to work around this, and people actually meme on this, and I think they're doing all they could do. Like, it's the only obvious solution. There is one sequence within terminals that erases what's visible and all your history. And so what they do is they erase the entire history and redraw the entire history in order but that's just a Band-Aid so they could redraw what's not visible. I think this is a really good example of where terminals need to innovate. And I have talked to some people on the Claude Code team about what this might look like. I have this power as a terminal emulator author. If I were able to introduce sequences that gave you the ability to redraw what wasn't in the screen incrementally, not without redrawing the whole thing, would you have to erase the whole screen anymore? And the answer would be no. And that would get rid of a lot of the flickering problems, because even with synchronized output, the problem is with enough history, it just takes forever to redraw that many screens. And so you could get rid of a lot of the flickering problems and clean this up. And so that's a really good example of innovations that we can make in the terminal space. And then what does that lead to? What kind of applications then get built after that? It's an interesting question.
Right.
It didn't even click as much until you explained that limitation around the screen and how that scroll back becomes complicated. Before we dive deep, I'm also curious, there is the term of a terminal emulator, right? And then you have your shell, and then there's terminal multiplexers, with TMUX and screen. Yeah. For anyone who's listening, can you sort of draw that boundary? You already gave us a small insight into how Claude Code operates.
Yes.
Can you talk about this? Because that's super interesting to me in terms of understanding the complexity behind building something like Ghostty.
Yeah, and it's a super important question because people complain to me all the time about stuff that is not it's the shell's problem or it's the multiplexer's problem. It's very unclear where those layers are. So I think this is a really important thing that I wish everybody understood. So we'll start simple and add to it. So simply at the beginning, you have a terminal emulator, you have a shell, and then you have whatever program you're running. So let's use Claude Code as an example. And so when you run the terminal, I think people think terminals execute commands. But for the most part, terminals ever only execute one command, and that is your shell. So a terminal starts up, we launch the shell, and that's what's running for a long time. And the terminal is just drawing. It's like a graphical interface to the shell, basically. The shell then is the thing that's actually executing everything underneath. And the way everything communicates, you might imagine that the way browsers, communicate is you have JavaScript that talks to the DOM. The way another tool might communicate is you have a program that's using a REST API. The API layer for a terminal is called the PTY, and it's just a byte stream. And if you output text to the byte stream, we draw text to the terminal, but you could also output special invisible characters, control characters, in order to do things like move the cursor and so on. And so what ends up happening is the terminal starts, we create this PTY, we launch the shell, we hand it the PTY. So now we have sort of the mailbox. They're sending mail, we're receiving mail. That's basically how that is. And then what the shell does is when you execute Claude Code, it also hands Claude Code the same PTY. It basically yields control for a while. So the shell no longer has the ability to write to it. It says, I'm leasing you basically this PTY. You take over the screen. When Claude Code exits, I get the PTY back. And so there can only ever be one person running the screen at a time, things like that. So, okay, so that's the fundamentals. Now you could introduce one more layer, which is a multiplexer, like TMUX in there. And so the way this works is you have a terminal emulator, which launches your shell. You have your shell, which then launches your multiplexer, and it's long living. So that's all your shell's done at this point. And now you have the multiplexer, which itself is doing a multiplexer is a terminal. It's creating more PTYs and handing them off to more shells in the same way that if you made more windows with Ghostty, we would be creating multiple PTYs. And the important thing here that people don't understand is a terminal multiplexer on its own is a full-blown terminal. It has to parse and draw and handle all the same things that terminal is, but instead of rendering pixels to a with a GPU that Ghostty is doing, it's rendering more terminal escape sequences to get another thing to render the pixels. So the closest analogy there is it's kind of like virtualization. You're running another OS on top of an OS. And so that's why things get slower. That's why you get less features, because if you do squiggly underlines and the multiplexer doesn't understand squiggly underlines, then it's gonna ignore it and it's not going to send it to the parent. And so like you end up in this least common denominator scenario. So there's a lot of features we shipped with Ghostty that people will say, oh, but it's not working. And one of my first questions when these things aren't working is, are you running Tmux? And it's like, yes, like Tmux doesn't know this new feature. So that's why.
For example, Raycast. There's a feature in Raycast where you can select text and you can use it as input for Raycast commands. For example, you can select text on the browser and you can pipe that as an input for a command, for an AI command, for example. So you can like translate text, or I have one for TTS. So I select text and I have a command and it generates, like it plays audio out of that. And you cannot do that on Tmux. If you do it on the terminal and you have Tmux open, it doesn't work. But if it's just the terminal, then it works. So like Tmux kind of breaks this interface, for example.
And it's like theoretically possible, but it would require new terminal capabilities and it would require Tmux to adopt them. And so like just that specific example, that works because programs like Ghostty, when we render our text interface, we actually integrate with like accessibility APIs that tell the OS, this is a text field. These are the ranges where you could get the characters, and it could grab those. Tmux has no way to tell Ghostty that. And so when Tmux sends all its text to Ghostty, we just see what it like wants us to see. Like we're just seeing the frame, right? Again, like another analogy there would be like a video player that's only being sent the current frame. Like we can't go back in time. We can't see like the history and things like that because the actual other thing sending us the frame is what owns it. So if there were a way, which doesn't exist today, for Tmux to actually send us the history without rendering it, enough for us to know where you are on the scroll back and things like that, then the terminal emulator in theory could also expose that to the OS and enable all this. But that's an example of a platform feature that just doesn't exist today.
I sheepishly, in my early days of Ghostty, was going to point out, I'm like, oh, wait, Ghostty doesn't seem to work with, I think it was SSH. I don't even know if it was like Tmux, but with SSH. Yeah. And that's when I ran into the issue that I think you probably got a whole bunch of people asking the same thing. And then you talked about the declaration about like Xterm, Xterm Ghostty being a separate thing. And then the workaround where when you plug into some of these older shells and older multiplexers, you sort of like the workaround is you declare it as a Xterm 256 or whatever it is. I forget off the top of my head, in order to work around some of these issues, right? Because otherwise, unless the shell you're connecting to adopts some of these patterns, like there's not much you can do, right?
Yeah, we're in the world. This is just a broken system that I want to fix. But we're in this world where basically everybody is determining terminal capabilities by user agent sniffing. That's all that is. I don't know, depending on listeners and how old they are and what they were a part of. But like I remember when user agent sniffing got attacked a lot because it wasn't good. It wasn't accurate. That's why everyone, Chrome also sends Firefox and their user agent still, and things like that. That's why Ghostty has Xterm in its term. But there's luckily, the browser shipped a solution to this, which was feature detection via JavaScript rather than user agent. Terminals already have a solution for this as well. And Xterm actually invented it. And there's a protocol called XT-GIT-TCAP, all capital letters. But basically, it's a way for the program running to ask the terminal, hey, do you support a specific feature? And the terminal responds yes or no, or you don't get a response which says that it doesn't even understand XT-GIT-TCAP, which you can make assumptions from at that point. Pretty much every mainstream terminal supports this to this point. I don't know if like Mac OS built-in terminal does, but every other third-party terminal does. Xterm does. This is what they should be doing. They should not be reading the term. And the biggest violator of this are shells. It's like NeoVim has used XT-GIT-TCAP for years. You could use NeoVim across SSH, even if your shell is totally broken with Ghostty. You launch NeoVim and everything like magically fixes itself because NeoVim realizes it's in a very capable terminal through this mechanism. And shells don't. And, it's like Bash and Z shell and all these things are just so archaic in terms of like they move so slow. I don't know who is maintaining them, but they just seem very pleased with where they are and not innovating very hard. Like all the best Bash and Z shell environments have tons of plugins. I've always had the mentality where if a majority of your user base is using a plugin, that plugin should be a first-party feature. I imagine they disagree, like philosophically, but yeah, we need the shells to at least use XT-GIT-TCAP. That would fix all the SSH issues.
It's very interesting. On the topic of the multiplexers thing we were just talking, do you think is there a future or is there a scenario where it kind of makes sense to integrate some of that into Ghostty? Is there something that people keep asking about?
Yeah, I think so for sure. So Tmux actually has something called Tmux Control Mode. It's a pretty bad API, but it exists. But it is a way for us to map Tmux's state to native Windows and things like that. And we are working on supporting that. And within Ghostty itself, I mean, I do want to do it, but I do think that the best way to do it is probably via another application like Tmux, like based on libghostty or something like that, because you need a client server model at that point. Like you need something that's long lived, that's keeping things. Like if you command Q and quit Ghostty, when processes end on an operating system, usually one of the first things they do is close all their file descriptors and like clean up. That's the exact opposite of what you want to happen with a session restoration mechanism. And so you need something that you could like command Q the GUI of Ghostty, but the actual terminals remain running in the background. And that is a headless server-like thing. And bolting that on to a GUI directly feels wrong. So I'm not committing to doing this, but like I'm leaning towards the direction of creating it a separate thing, having it ship with Ghostty. So like it just works out of the box, for example, but like that's how like you could do that separation.
One of your primary goals was like just that native platformness, right? Like, that being a good citizen of the respective platform that you're in and building the best possible terminal app in that. I imagine that means there's some form of cross-platform architecture you're using, because you said you started this on like the Linux world. I'm guessing you're not building like independent clients for Linux, independent clients for Mac OS. And I know you mentioned libghostty, so I guess that's where we're going. But I'm curious, how do you prevent having to rewrite the code for each of these platforms, right? Is there some cross-platform architecture you've thought about? What was your decision around that when you built Ghostty?
Yeah, I think it's a very classic, decades old, separating out the business logic from the view logic. So there absolutely is completely separate, totally non-portable UI code for every platform. But it is back like the Mac app is written in Swift. It only builds in Xcode. You can't build it from Linux. The Linux app is Zig, but it's using GTK and native like the G object system and all that stuff. But behind all of this, there's a shared core that we call libghostty. It's basically the core business logic that is cross-platform. And so there's an API there that handles basically 100% of the terminal emulations, amongst some other concerns as well. So we have like a cross-platform core that for keyboard encoding, for example, not quite terminal emulation, but basically if you take whatever Swift or AppKit on macOS or GTK on Linux or a Windows input system, if you take that and form it into the right structure, then we will handle all the shared logic of how you convert that to what a terminal expects. And so that's all libghostty.
What was the goal from libghostty from the start? Like, did you have that vision from the get-go?
Pretty shortly. So, Ghostty started as I didn't think it would ever be a real project. It started as an educational project for me. So I started building this terminal. And then once I got to a point where I realized that Ghostty could be useful to other people, it was right around the same time that I realized sort of how much work it is to build a terminal emulator and what a waste that is, because they pretty much all should do the same thing. And a platform behaves best when you get the same behaviors everywhere, right? I think one of the issues right now is there's so much fragmentation in terminals. Like you want a certain amount of alternate implementations, but I think we're at the point with terminals where there's probably like over 100. And so part of that vision quickly turned, I would say 3 months into the Ghostty project, quickly turned into the real mission of the project is to build a reusable, embeddable library so that people could focus on the higher level unique features and value adds and differences they want to build while having a super fast, super stable cross-platform terminal emulation at the core. When I say this, some people think, and the way I just described it makes it sound like I want programs like Kitty or Alacrity or Terminal App to re-platform on libghostty. Some of that would be nice, but I don't think that's practically what I see happening. What I really see is there's a much bigger world beyond first-party terminals of other programs that their primary function is not being a terminal that has a terminal embedded or has terminal-like behaviors embedded. So the two biggest examples I give are editors and like cloud systems. So editors, for example, VS Code, JetBrains stuff, they all have a terminal built in. VS Code uses Extreme.js and JetBrains uses their own Jedi terminal. They're good efforts, but they all have shortcomings. And so I think like that's a good example of where it would make much more sense to use something like libghostty. And then the cloud systems is more of a read-only terminal. But if you go to like previously Heroku, Docker, AWS, Vercel, all these things, like when it's doing build logs, the stuff that's coming out of the build log is actually terminal sequences, and they're doing their own like custom thing usually, hopefully using Extreme.js at the very least, but they're doing their own thing to show a read-only version of a terminal. But also a lot of those provide, like if you have a running app, like a web-based like SSH, give me a console into this application. And that's a full-blown terminal at that point, read-write. And those usually have a ridiculous amount of bugs because it's a really, really like, it's not their first priority. It's not their second priority. It's like their 8th, 9th priority of the platform. And so they're just riddled with good enough, and good enough is never good enough. And so that's the world where I think libghostty could really revolutionize and just make it so that that building block of having a totally free, unencumbered, high quality, foundational piece that you could adopt is there for you. And that's part of the reason also I put Ghostty into a nonprofit organization, is I wanted to make sure that everyone felt comfortable adopting this thing, knowing that there's no commercialization strategy here. There's no there's no rug pull type stuff happening here. Like I'm really just trying to build critical free infrastructure for components.
You've always been like a champion / steward of open source, right? And it's funny, I ran into one of your tweets recently where there's another popular variant that uses libghostty called CMux now, right? I'm sure you've heard of them.
Yeah, really popular.
Someone was like, oh my God, wouldn't you want Ghostty to be the primary client? And you said something to the effect where, no, you want to see more clients and you believe forking in the open source world is okay versus like everything merging back to the primary sort of code base. Can you talk a little about that? What's the mentality there?
Yeah. I think this is one of the real, I think AI is destroying open source in a lot of ways, but I also think it's not black and white. I think that one of the ways that AI is making open source amazing is the ability for people to more easily maintain personal forks. And even before AI, I always thought this should be the case where there should be way more forks. I think that, my view on the real philosophical ideals of open source is really the freedom to do what you want with your software. You could break that down to the original free software movement, 4 fundamental freedoms, but really it's the freedom to inspect your software, modify your software, things like that. And there's no part of the open source movement that has a centralized maintainer team and a distributing generalized software for the masses. Like that has nothing to do with open source. That is like, to me, and I'm a part of the problem here with what I did with HashiCorp and stuff, I think that came from funded, subsidized capital, basically creating products that are open source, right? Open source isn't about a product. It's you can't expect that same experience from open source unless it's funded in some way. And so I feel like there's like a whole generation, whether it's age-based or just timing in the industry-based, there's like a whole generation now that doesn't understand that. And so I do get angry people sometimes where they'll be like, I built this PR and I'm like, yeah, I don't want it. And then they feel like I'm obligated because it's high quality code. And I'll be like, it is high quality code. And it's a interesting feature idea. I'm like, it is an interesting feature idea. It's like, I just don't want to maintain it in my project. But you understand that open source lets you fork it and maintain it in your own project. I tweeted this thing a while back. It got a lot of people on the positive and negative side where I sort of tongue in cheek said that the PR process is more than anything a transfer of maintainership. That's all it is. And so if you view it from that lens, it's kind of like someone bringing you a puppy. And it's like, why would you not accept this puppy? It's like, yeah, it's really cute and I love puppies, but like, I don't want to feed it. I don't want to be responsible for this thing. So I'm going to say no. That's how I view it, is like, there should be way, way, way more personal forks. And actually it makes software so much better because I think it's so hard to build large scale products because one of the things you have to do is you have to balance how many features you bring in and how impactful they are for how many people and how they interact with each other. and how you sort of generalize features. If somebody comes to me and wants like a really specific thing that would be really helpful to them, but wouldn't be helpful to most people, you want to say no to that. Like ideally, you want to be like, this is a perfect opportunity for you to do this by yourself. And it's great. So I think it's awesome. I think there should be way more forks. And I think, the ideals of CMUX and stuff are both awesome from a fork perspective, but also from a libghostty perspective. That's like the real mission of Ghostty is to enable stuff like that. And it's not to make Ghostty the application super popular.
Makes sense. You mentioned AI, so maybe it's time to rile you up a little. The podcast is an AI developer podcast, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think a lot of us started in the same journey. All of us were like probably AI skeptics to start, and then over time we became converts. One of the easiest arguments I would make is like, come on, dude. If people like Mitchell Hashimoto are saying they're giving AI a fair shot and they're coming up with cool workflows, you owe it to yourself to at least experiment and try these things out. You wrote a really popular blog post called AI Adoption Journey. What was the motivation behind writing that blog post for you specifically?
Yeah, it's basically what you just described. I feel like the internet was too filled with commentary that was either too negative or too positive. It was like too extreme on both sides. And I wanted to just share a more nuanced take because I do feel like I'm very much not a hype-driven person. I'm not attracted by hype. I actually have to I really dislike hype. Like I have to actively, when something is really hyped up, I know I'm entering it with a negative bias. And so AI was the same. I have to actively work personally, mentally, like to eliminate that bias and try to give it an independent, fair shot. And so I wanted to just write something that was more reasonable about how I found value in this thing. That was one side. The other side was I did feel like the negative, the people that were against it were not giving it a fair shot. And they were coming at it with they were coming at it with not good intentions to begin with. There's people that'll be like, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then they just like open up chatgpt.com or something and try to write an application in their browser and it outputs something. And they're like, it didn't compile, AI is garbage. And I'm like, that's a totally psychotic way to adopt any new tool. Like ignore AI. Like if someone said, this is a hammer, it hammers nails. And then you like hit the table and it broke the table. You'd be like, this hammer's a piece of trash. It's like, that's a totally insane way to evaluate a tool. And so I wanted to sort of give, again, a more measured approach to how, just look at it like a tool. And if you look at it like a tool, how would you approach any other tool? And how do you get value out of that?
That's super interesting. And I think one of the first steps you mentioned on the article, like on that sequence of the journey, was like dropping the chatbot. Like, can you tell more about that? Because we also made like an episode going on this AI coding ladder that you go through multiple steps, right?
Yeah. I mean, people figure this out in 2023, but if you give an AI tools and you give it the ability to use tools, it is so much more capable. It's not even the same thing. It's a different category. And so the chat interfaces have their place. And every single chat interface today also is using tools in the background. Like that's how important they are. You could see that in chatgpt.com. If you search for what is the weather somewhere, you'll see it pull out a web search tool and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. So you could see it using tools. And so programming is the same way. And I think it's very human in that sense. Like if you go and ask somebody to don't look at the internet, don't look at any docs, and you just prompt them to write you a full application from scratch in an editor, they're going to probably have syntax errors and they're going to have bugs and they're going to have issues, unless this person is like doing that every single day. But that's how it's going to be. And so like, you got to give humans access to Google thing. You got to give them access to a shell in order to test their build. AI is the same way. And when you do that, it just performs so much better. So step one for me, for anybody evaluating AI, is use a true agentic tool. And again, people sometimes hear agentic and they're like, oh, this is some like buzzwordy bullshit. It's a really simple definition. An agent is just an AI that has access to tools. That's all that is. And so like, don't give that more credit than it deserves. When I say agent, I'm just being very intentional about saying it's an AI with tool access without having to continually say AI with tool access, agent. That's all I mean.
When you actually started on that, like using AI, was it already when there was like Claude Code kind of like tools, or did you start even before, like with Copilot chat, and then you evaluated and it was bad? And
Yeah, I think I had a pretty like organic. Like I said, I was never on the hype side, so I would say I was always like a fairly late adopter on this stuff. I started with tab models, so Copilot tabbing, and even I was against that because you can find like past stuff I've done where I really like a dumb editor, and so I was sort of against even having that in there. I sort of stopped my brains at syntax highlighting, like that's good, but beyond that, I don't need anything. But I was like, kind of same thing. I like to give everything a fair shot. And so I was like, I'm going to install Copilot, then I'm going to the tab model, and I'm going to give it a shot. And that I was impressed. I was like, okay, it's like pretty good. And so I kept that. That was way before Claude Code. And then Claude Code came out and I didn't use it right away. I actually did try. The first thing that really drew me into coding was actually Gemini, and I forgot what version it was, but around the time Claude Code came out, everyone was talking about how good this new Gemini model was. And I was working on this feature on Ghostty, and I was working on UI, and I don't really like working on UI. And so what I did was I took a screenshot of the UI I want, which was not a Mac app. It was a website. I just took a screenshot. I dropped it into Gemini. One of the new things about this Gemini model was it was multimodal, which was one of the first times. So I was like, let's see how good it is a picture. So I dropped this picture and I asked it, this is a chat, this is not an agent. And I asked it to give me the Swift UI code to generate that same thing. And it pooped out a ton of code. I copied and pasted it. And this time it actually did just compile. There was no issues with it. And when I ran it, it was like really close. And that was my first like, oh shit moment. And that's what caused me to sort of like get further into like,
there's something there.
There's something there. I followed up with some like, let's change it to do this and this, and it totally started failing. And so like, I was like, okay, like this is total crap. But how did I get it so good the first time, and how can I do that again? And it sort of led me down that challenge. So that was that, and then I started adopting agents and stuff.
You mentioned this point in that step, which I thought made a lot of sense, which is that transition, right? Because models like coding models specifically, like Opus and Codex, they're trained, with the bias towards using tools. Like that's you added that as a footnote, but I was like, oh man, that is like really powerful, and that's a good reasoning behind why you should move towards like an agent versus a chatbot, right? Because they are biased towards using tools better than just a conversational model, so to speak. Yeah.
Like one of the things I see online is when people say, oh, but they hallucinate all the time. And to me, that's a huge red flag to me, because I'm like, the harness makes it actually impossible for them to hallucinate. Because if they hallucinate, immediately the tool will tell them they're wrong and they will loop and fix the hallucination. And so when people say, oh, it hallucinates something, to me, that screams to me that you're not using an agent or you're giving it the wrong tools. Because if you're expecting an AI to produce working software based only on training data, it's absolutely going to hallucinate. But you give it a tool that tells it you're wrong, and it'll never do that. And so, well, it'll ultimately never do that. It'll do that in intermediary steps, but that doesn't matter.
It is a perfect transition. And in step 2, you talked about reproducing your own work, right? So you basically code the thing up the way you would personally, and then you would try to prompt your way through like getting the agent to reproduce that work. Can you talk about that process? What were you doing? Were you prompting? Were you training a model to like follow you around? Or what was that process around like trying to reproduce your work with AI?
Yeah, just prompting. And this was I think I said this in the blog post too, this wasn't like an extremely painful period of time. I think I only did this for like 2 or 3 weeks because it's so time intensive and it feels like a total waste in the moment. But yeah, basically what I was doing was I would use something like Claude Code and I would get a really bad result. And I sort of felt like I was getting gaslit because so many other people were having good results. And I was like, I have to be doing something wrong. Like I have to be doing something wrong. And so, it's sort of like what you said. I saw all these people that I respected that were claiming that they were having good results, and I wasn't having good results. And so I blamed myself, and I was in fact wrong. And so the way I decided to give it a fair shot, again, I try to give everything a fair shot, is I will do the work myself that I produce, and I'm going to challenge myself to find the right sequence of prompts and tools in order to produce something that is equivalent in terms of quality. Again, like I'm not expecting like identical code output, but like I wanted it to be something that I would accept as a PR. And you don't always get there. And like that's part of the learning process, is figuring out like, oh, if I can't get it to get there, this is one of the things a model's not very good at right now. But then you find stuff where like I said, one of the first things, I said this in this blog post, one of the first things that popped out of that, which is everybody who uses agentic tools has pretty much accepted as a good thing. It's starting to be challenged now, but it was a good thing for a solid year, was splitting out the planning and execution steps. If you actually plan and produce a plan in one session, reset your context window and give it the plan to execute, much higher quality results. Nowadays, agent models are getting much better, where in a lot of cases that actually doesn't produce better results. But those are the types of things you learn just doing it. And yeah, it's really hard to find this content because there's so much content out there that is just like hype driven. And like, I just want to find the meat of how I could actually swing the hammer correctly, right? Like, I don't need people gaslighting me about how shit of a job I'm doing. Like, I want concrete things. So I'm trying to give some like concrete examples of what I did to actually get better at this. And similar to any tool, you know, you got to put in the reps in order to like get good at it. Like, you can't just like pull something off the shelf and be an expert immediately, or expect that you're going to perform at the same level as somebody who's been working at it for 6 months. It is a tool, and tool has benefits to experience.
Again, one of those insights that came from the blog post. I loved how you phrased it. You know, you've been around the block with tools, dev tools, even non-AI ones, right? And that friction, that force you feel when you try to adopt a new tool, that's real across the board, right? It's not just AI that's having that. I thought that was great, because then it gives people that leeway to think like, no, this is fine for now, but you know, there will come a time when I'm like as conversant as any other tool. So that was super helpful, at least for me, when I read your blog post.
Yeah. And you can't, one thing I've also said is you can't judge something really unless you're an expert at both sides of it. Like anybody's judgment without being an expert on both sides, all that is a judgment of the learning process. It's not a judgment of the thing itself.
Yes.
And so like, it's basically saying like, oh, learning this thing sucks, or this thing sucks as a beginner. Like that's fair. Like, that's what you are. And so like, I want to try to get on the other side of things so I could properly judge something. And and sometimes you get on the other side and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to use this. Not good for me. But with AI, you know, it's not black and white. I get on the other side and it's like, I'll use it for this stuff. I don't really like it for this stuff. Yeah.
Also, you mentioned one of the steps, there's like end of day agents. It's like some work that you get like at the end of the day that you want to automate. And can you actually like explain this point better, and like what kind of task would you recommend to have in this kind of workflow? Do you still have this workflow nowadays, or?
This is sort of addressing like the fact that, especially, again, this is general to any tool, but with AI, one of the things that is so hyped around AI is how it's making people, the claim is that it's making people more effective. They're doing more with less and things like that. And then there's a ton of like counter research showing that no, actually even senior people are working slower and all this stuff. And I'm just trying to like ignore that whole thing. Like, I don't even care. Like, maybe it makes you more effective. Maybe it makes you worse. If we just agree to just not give a shit about whatever the results are of that, one of the ways I felt I could get value and actually be more effective is, can it do work for me in times when I just wouldn't be able to do work? Like, in that sense, it has to be a net positive for that, because like, these are moments where I just wouldn't be working at all. And so one of the challenges I gave myself was the last 30, I put a calendar alert 30 minutes before sort of my end of day, whatever that was for the given day. And, you know, you're coming out of flow anyway. I think all of us as engineers know that at the end of the day, you can't really get into anything big anymore because you're going to have to sign off soon anyway. So I was like, okay, let me just like exit that a little bit early. I'm already in the process anyway. And let me just like think of some things that I would love to know when I get back to work tomorrow morning, and kick off a bunch of agents to look into that for me. So yeah, I kick off a bunch of research tasks. At the time when I started, it would just be like OpenAI deep research type stuff. Like, I would just like kick off like 5 of them. I would try to do more than one. Nowadays, I'm actually finding like other tools. I'm trialing stuff all the time. One I've been using recently is like a new startup called Spline. It's getspline.ai. I like it because it does a much deeper analysis. I mean, literally, like if you give it a research topic, it might take over an hour for it to produce a result. And it does use a lot of tokens and it does do some crazy stuff. But you know, stuff like that is what I'm trying to do. I launched one yesterday, for example, where I'm trying to make libghostty work better with WebAssembly. It already works with WebAssembly, but I'm trying to make it more ergonomic. And one of the questions I had at the end of the day was, I want to do a survey of all JavaScript wrappers of WebAssembly blobs and understand how they're making, specifically what I was looking for is like, how are they making like C function pointers more ergonomic? And so I started this research task, which was like, build me a list of all projects that wrap WebAssembly blobs that have function pointers, explain and categorize their approach, explain the background of why WebAssembly is this way, like what are the options for passing a web pointer between the host bridge, all this stuff. And yeah, I just launched that off, and it was done in about an hour. And I actually, I'm often like having dinner and stuff like this, so I didn't read that till I was in bed like 4 hours later. But it's like one of those things where it's like cool, like it did a shitload of Googling for me that I wouldn't do, or that would have taken me a long time. And so I call it a warm start. It gets you into the next step with it doesn't give you the answer. It's not going to like solve the problem for you, but it's going to get you into the process warmer than if you had nothing.
And do you use this for just coding specific tasks, or do you just use it for all kinds of things? Like,
we recently moved into a new house, and I took a picture of where we're setting up our gym, and I started some deep research tasks on I need to organize this. So find other gyms that have this sort of similar layout. These are the equipment that I have. Find me Amazon links to that equipment. List out, create a table, an Excel spreadsheet actually of all the pricing and stuff like that. And it's not like I'm going to take that table and just blindly buy everything it tells me to buy, but it gives me such a like better like point of view of like, oh, like I didn't even know this type of thing existed, or like, like putting racks there makes a ton of sense. Like that layout makes sense. And it just gives me the better framework to get working. So I try to do it with whatever's going on.
I think the term you mentioned is such a nice turn of phrase, right? Warm start for the next day. So this like get your agents to do the work so that when you come back tomorrow, it saved you a ton of time in some of the things that you don't necessarily have to do yourself. The next step you mentioned is like outsource the slam dunks. I guess at this stage, you mentioned you're confident enough that AI will do some of this stuff. Like at least you have a sense of the tasks that it does well. But does this transition into you saying, okay, now I'm confident, so I'll let AI do it all? Or is there an element of like, no, I still have to, be the gatekeeper before AI takes that action? I'm curious, like how far do you go with the outsourcing?
I mean, I think one of the things is if you're trying to be more productive with AI, and you've sort of put in the reps and you've learned how this thing works, everyone I've talked to reaches a point where you do understand certain problems that work really well with AI and certain problems that don't work well with AI. And when you start getting the sense of what works really well with AI, like I just start seeing it in GitHub issues and stuff. And then you just got to ask yourself, like, do I want to work on this? Is this the best use of my time? Like, I think one of the huge benefits of AI is it lets me work on what I want more than before. Before you always reach that point where like, oh, okay, I got to do. So like, I know one that nobody likes. Like, I got to the point where I got to write a bunch of YAML to do like GitHub actions or something. And nobody likes this, but I got to do it because CI is important. And now it's that point where like the agent could definitely do like 95% of that. And so there's some aspect of that. But for me, I come up and I look at my issues. And if there's stuff where I'm like, the agent's probably going to get this right, that's the outsource of slam. Like it's going to slam dunk this. So just like, let it do it. It's not auto merging. I'm still going to review it afterwards, but I kind of know what it's going to look like in my head already. And so like, just let it do it. And if it looks right and the test pass and all that stuff, like just send it. And it saves me a ton of time. I just did it like 30 minutes before this call. I fixed the bug that way, which again, I saw the issue. I knew exactly where we needed to change the code. I knew exactly what tests I had to run. It probably would have taken me 15 minutes to fix this bug, but I had another call to go on to. And so, but I also recognized an AI is going to get this right for sure. There's enough reproduction steps, test steps, everything in the issue. It's going to do fine. So one of my favorite prompts in that case is like use the use the GitHub command line tool. And I just paste in the URL, like look at this issue and fix it. If the issue itself has enough of the context, you don't need a prompt to do that. You just need to tell it where to find it and it goes. And I did that. My call was half an hour. I came back and I merged it and it's done. So yeah.
You mentioned turn your desktop notifications off in this step. I'm not sure if you followed this. There was this tip people said like, oh, with Claude hooks, you can basically have this peon that says like, you're done. Like, hey, job complete, like move to the next thing. I'll be honest, I was definitely on that wagon as well. But I did get to that point where like, yeah, it's at some point like the chaos is a lot. You bring up the point about how context changing is still a killer for us as developers, right? Do you still feel that, or do you think we'll have to evolve, like the discipline will have to evolve into this world where you just need to be okay with context shifting, where in the past, like, as developers, we are like, hey, protect this, no meeting time, give those long slots. Where do you land on that? Do you still feel strongly about context changing being an important thing that you have to protect?
Yeah, I do. I think that I definitely like selectively turn on notifications for certain things, but that's how I think it should be. Like, I don't like the idea that by default it always interrupts you. My view is I'd rather like per exception be able to like whatever right click something or press a keybind and just basically turn on notifications. Be like, this is one I care about. This is one, or I'm in a mode where like I'm iterating with you on this. So like I want to know when you're done. I think that what too many people do, I've like literally seen people in like this office that I work at do this, where they start something in an agent and then they tab over and they're like on social media or they're on like YouTube or like whatever. And I think that's how you're not working more efficiently with AI. Like the way you work more efficiently with AI is you set it off, you hopefully send off multiple on little vision quests, and then you yourself are doing something productive. And the problem is like, even if I'm like writing a document, writing an email, like I want to finish that email before I get back to the agents. So what I'd rather do is not get notified, be typing up emails. And when I'm done with all my emails, tab over and be like, okay, who's ready for me? That's what I think is more important. You're not ignoring it for hours, but I don't want to be interrupted every 6-7 minutes.
I like it. You said by default, you don't want to be interrupted, which is the powerful piece, right? Which is like, you're okay if being notified.
Yeah. And I think there's a tooling problem. I think that agent orchestration tools, like there's so many out there, but things like SEMA, things like Conductor, things like that. Like, I think this is up for them to solve better. I also think that the funny thing is that we have this AI that's pretty good at making these contextual decisions, and yet we're not using it for this. Like, it's either all or nothing in terms of like, do I notify? I think this is actually something that probably a local model would do really well, but use a cheaper model, use like Gemini Flash or something like this, use an older model and just like have it analyze the context and be like, should I notify? Is this important enough for me to notify for? And actually like make the notifications probabilistic. And I think that would be good too.
I love that. I love that idea.
I was wondering if you are multitasking that much. Like, do you spawn like multiple sessions when you're working on a feature? Do you have multiple agents working on the side? Or you just literally focus on just one that maybe has a few sub-agents running? Nowadays, it's very common for us to start working on a feature and maybe something pops off and you start another agent working on something completely unrelated. And then you have like these two different threads going and then you're jumping back and forth depending.
It varies so much, but like I definitely regularly have one, and I definitely regularly have a bunch. And I think it matters what type of problem I'm working on. If I'm working on a problem that is pretty deep and is pretty like design heavy, then I'll probably have one. And I'm like, what I like to do when that's happening is I like having like codecs with extra high reasoning working on one terminal tab, and that's going to probably think for like 20 minutes. And then I like to be doing, as a human, I'm working on the exact same problem, and I'm going to compare notes when it's done of where we got to. We're not going to fix it in 20 minutes. This is a hard task. So in 20 minutes, we're just going to have a sense of what's going on, and then we guide from there and maybe switch to a more like interactive model like Opus or something. But like that's how I'll do deep problems. If I'm in a mode where like sometimes I get in a mindset where like, I don't want to think that hard right now. I'm tired. It's the end of the day or something. Or just like, I didn't sleep well. I have a toddler at home. So sometimes that happens, right? Like, I'll just be like, what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to do that dumb prompt I just told you about. Use GH to look at this thing. That's a skill now. I have extracted into a skill, but I'll like prompt it for the skill. And I'm going to I'm just going to launch this across like 20 GitHub issues. I call those like Hail Mary prompts. Like, I don't need them to solve the problem. I'm just trying to find which ones actually like reach their target. And so then I'll start like 20 in parallel and be like, fix these issues, work in a work tree, do all this stuff. And then again, I think this is a tooling problem. It's still, even though they've made spawning work trees a lot easier, a lot of these orchestration tools have not made merging all of them easier yet.
For sure.
It's still worth it for me to like have these 20 that I then look in and see like, okay, nope, you did that's garbage work, throw that away. Like, or it's like reached a point where like it needs my input. And again, maybe I'm tired. I'm like, I don't want to give you input, throw that away. We'll come back to that another day. And just like find the 3 or 4 that it did an excellent job that I probably wouldn't have done on my own in that moment, and then do that. So it's very modal in terms of how I'm thinking.
Makes sense. The next step is probably an extremely important one called harness engineering, like, engineer the harness. But actually, I think for this episode, we're going to skip it, Mitchell, because literally we did an entire episode in this. And one of the principal resources was your blog post.
Okay.
I think the last step that you had was always have an agent running.
Yeah.
This one is tricky because, again, the hype thing is a big turnoff, like for us as well, where they're like, oh, while I'm sleeping, I have like something going on. But I think you have a slightly different take. In the point you say, don't do it for the sake of it. Don't do it so you can boast on leaderboards, but expand on that, right? How do you how do you use this step? Like, how do you have an agent always running?
It's a frame of mind. It's not an literal thing. The way I temper it is it's highly aspirational. I aspire to always have an agent running. And I said this in one of the other podcasts I was in. I think realistically, while I'm not on a computer, I have an agent running maybe 3 out of the 12 hours that I'm not on a computer or whatever, like it's not, right. My hit rate on this is not high yet, but like it's an aspiration, and the frame of mind thing comes into how could I get there? And like, how could I get there in a way that provides value? And it's a challenge of what kind of agent framework do I need for it to do this in a meaningful way? One of the ways is like research every GitHub discussion and issue that comes in. There's startups that do this for you too, but like that's a way to have an agent running, like warm start stuff. Like instead of me manually kicking all this off, like I would love to come to every GitHub issue and have high signal in terms of review. I don't use any of those with my products right now because everyone I've tried, I'm not happy with the quality. That's the key thing, is like it's an aspiration. And in the same way, another aspiration I've had this year is every time the agent produces results that I'm not happy with, instead of me just fixing it by myself, which I still do, in addition to that, critically ask yourself, what could I have done differently? What tool could I have given this agent? What prompt could I have done differently so it didn't make that mistake again? So this year, just in my commits, you'll see I'm much more heavy-handed in terms of creating new skills, creating agents.md changes. I'm trying, and again, it's aspirational. I'm not perfect at it, but it's like, that's, I think, the right way to think about these tools.
Goes back to that engineering the harness thing you like mentioned, right? Like as software engineers, that feels like such a critical role today, which is like, are you setting up the guardrails?
Yeah, I think the funniest thing is like you look at all these people that, I can't even name names because I don't know their names, but you look at all these people that post leaderboards and talk about how much they're building with AI, the amount of value they're actually like, if you're doing that, like why is it not translating in terms of some sort of visible metric of success, like whatever that is, so whatever you choose to be, like apps that you're shipping that people are actually using, download numbers, financial acquisitions, right? You're being bought out. What are the outcomes for this thing? There's obviously some, but it's not. There's a huge disconnect to me in terms of what they're talking. So I don't take it that seriously.
Love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the only person that I respect that took it all the way is Pete Steinberger with OpenClaw. He's also a Ghostty contributor early on, and like. Yeah, I accepted. He was one of the first like slot PRs that I accepted because he was really transparent about it, like about that he had no idea what the fuck was going on, and but he sent it my way, and I did not accept it as is. I touched it up a lot, but it exposed a really good way to do things, and I think his approach is good. It's just he's the only one that's like getting actual outcomes out of it. Well, that's not true. You can't be the only one, but he's one of the few.
Since you wrote that post, because this is how AI works nowadays, right? It's so fast. Things happen so fast and changes so much. So like, since you wrote that post, is there anything that you look back and you think like, hey, things change a lot. I was so naive when I wrote that. Doesn't make sense anymore, or
it's pretty new, so not yet. But I mean, I think since that post, one of the big differences, I think I even mentioned though, is still accurate then is like, you don't need to plan as much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
In an interesting way, I think that Opus and Codex are diverging so much in such an interesting 100%. Way in their personality and the way they do tool calls and the way they write code. It's so different. And that's it's so interesting to me because yesterday OpenAI announced their Claude Code plugin, which I think is like a perfect like 4D chess move. Because that's exactly right. That's changing my workflow quite a bit. Auto research that has been getting a lot of hype recently. I haven't leveraged it. I've played around with it, but I haven't truly leveraged it yet. But that like totally makes sense. And yeah, things are changing. And but the most important trait you could have is just to go into everything open-minded about finding value or not.
It has been an absolute honor. Thank you so much for spending the time, and I'm sure listeners are going to love this show. It's been a complete honor.
Awesome. Cool.